All right, we are now live with the very first, we could call it inaugural, Dr. Sadler's AMA session. So I do a lot of online events that are usually focused on one particular thinker, one particular text. People ask me lots of questions about that particular topic, and then we usually end up straying into many other areas as a result as well. This one is an AMA. That means ask me anything, and I will try to, as best I can, to answer the questions. I may not have anything useful to say if it goes outside of my field of competence. And I'm going to try to get to as many of the questions as I can. So I don't see any questions yet, which is in a certain way a good thing. So let me tell you why I'm doing this in the first place as sort of a prelude to answering questions. As many of you may know, I'm on Patreon. I use Patreon, which is a form of crowdfunding, to help support the work that I do. You know, a lot of what I do is actually for free and offered, to the world online. And so I use Patreon as a way to try to provide some income that then allows me to, do what it is that I do. So in a way, it's sort of like having people all get together and sponsor you or bankroll you or something like that. And so that is what I've been doing. I pledged to, once I meet certain levels of support on Patreon, to do certain things. People have been after me for a long time to do a podcast, for example, and that's at a higher level, or to convert my videos into podcasts. That also comes at a higher level. But the very first thing that I decided I would do is an AMA session. And ask me anything. So it looks like I've already got some questions, and let me start taking some of them. The first question: have you read The Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald? That does not ring a bell. And actually, I've probably read a lot of books that I don't remember having read. Somebody asked me a question in Goodreads, how many books I'd read in my lifetime, and I said, I have no idea how many books I've read. It's sort of like asking some over-the-road trucker, just how many miles have you driven? Who knows? Probably put in another 900 today. Daniel Jackson, how many books have you published? Can you tell a bit about them and the best way to buy them? So to my chagrin, I have at this point in time published only one book, although I'm working on several book projects. It seems like I'm always working on several book projects, but it's, working on them and then actually bringing them to publication is a whole another ball game. So the one book that I have published is called Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Philosophy Debates in France, and that was back in 2011, and that's more of a, you could say, a specialist volume, although I attempted to make it as accessible as possible. That's a set of translations from this very important debate that took place between a number of French intellectuals about the nature, the possibility, the existence of Christian philosophy. And it's got about a 100-page introduction, a chronological bibliography that's about 25 pages. So it's designed to fill a niche in scholarship. And it's an area that I'm still pretty interested in, but I just haven't had much time to work on lately. I will tell you a few of the book projects I'm working on right now. Currently, I'm writing a book on Stoicism and what in accordance with nature means, and that's supposed to be not an academic volume, although it'll be pretty rigorous, but for ordinary people, particularly those in the modern Stoicism movement, who are wondering what's all this business about in accordance with nature, and then addressing sort of the perennial Nietzsche quote that gets put up there in the Stoicism forums, you Stoics on nature, and how Nietzsche's actually got them wrong on that. And then I'm working on a few books on anger as well, which is another subject area that I do quite a bit on. Fusion writes, what would you say the benefits, dangers philosophy has on society? So that's a huge, broad question. I would say that at this point in time, there aren't really a lot of dangers that philosophy has for society, not philosophy as such. But there's a lot of benefits, getting people to actually think about things in a what we call a critical manner, which doesn't mean just making arguments and bashing everything, but actually looking to see whether the claims that we're making have some sort of decent foundation, engaging with interlocutors. Philosophy is supposed to be the sort of the subject area for ethics. Not every philosopher necessarily, including those in ethics, necessarily lives a life that shows what ethics is supposed to be about, but I think that's a role. I think that the biggest issue, though, is that much of the philosophy that you find out there is very technical and written in ways that make it more or less irrelevant to most people's lives. So we philosophers have not done a good job over the last 100 years or so in making a case for the importance of our work, with some great exceptions, people who I particularly like. Tyler says, given that you're a great communicator for the field of philosophy, would you say that philosophy above other subjects has poor public communication? So this is a great follow-up question. Yes, I would say on average, most people who are trained in philosophy and continue in the field wind up becoming academic philosophers. Most academics are not very good communicators. Interestingly, they also tend to be rather resistant to calls to be better communicators when it really would improve their teaching, their study. And some people are just not particularly good or comfortable with communication, and that's that's what it is. But I think that when I hear my peers complaining about a university, for example, there's another university in Missouri that just is closing its philosophy department, and people get all worked up about that. I ask, okay, so what outreach were you doing? Did you actually make the case for why you are indispensable? Did you show people why what you're doing really matters? Or did you sort of just rely on the institution to cover you no matter what? And I think we're moving into a new era. And I'll talk maybe a bit more about that if we see some other questions coming up. Kyle asks a question that I don't really have an awful lot of opinion on. I should actually, because I was a mathematics major back when I was an undergraduate, but that was over 20 years ago. Do you believe mathematics to be discovered, invented, or both? I guess I would probably say both, in part because I think that there are, mathematical truths that are out there, but I think that the work that human beings do in trying to figure out how we can make sense out of these truths and map them onto things, some of that I would say is invented. If you think about, for example, Cantor's discussion of infinity and developing transfinite numbers, or Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which takes a lot of work to get to understand. By the way, there's a really great book if you want to try to get your head around it. Gödel, Escher, Bach. I think it's called An Eternal Golden Braid. We spent an entire semester on that when I was a mathematics major. Okay, here's a good question from Dave Yen. What does your philosophy firm do exactly? Well, a whole bunch of things. So there isn't an exactly thing. I would say the main things that I end up spending much of my time on are content production, which you've seen videos of me most likely. That's something that we're doing. Again, some of it is supported by Patreon supporters. It doesn't really underwrite all the work that I do, but a good portion of it. We offer online classes. I have a lot more of those to build out, but a lot of what I do is tutorials with everybody from college students to lifelong learners to working professionals to CEOs of corporations to other professors as well. I do a good bit of consulting work, primarily in ethics. I'm working with two firms right now, one of which is an Australian internet security firm, another of which is not a firm but an institution, a psychotherapy center. I do philosophical counseling, which is taking resources from philosophical texts, thinkers, and adapting them to helping people work through their life situations. I do some executive coaching, some leadership coaching as well. And I do some academic coaching. What am I leaving out? Public speaking. I also I created the business originally, so I'd have some way to bill my public speaking as I was starting to do more of that, but then it kind of branched out into a lot of things. So here's an interesting question from Uffe Lingdahl. I'm sure I'm going to mangle this. Sørensen. What is your take on Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology? I have not read Harman. I have met him, actually, over in Switzerland at European Graduate School when I was a visiting scholar one summer. I was there with my wife, who's a ABD, all but dissertation candidate with that, and I got to ask him an interesting question, which drew a lot of laughs. I can't say that I fully understand what he's up to, so I'm not really competent to say much about that. Faryal Ghul asks, can I explain exactly what Aristotle's Universals in particulars are? Not really in this context. That's a long conversation. So, I mean, what I will say is, as opposed to Plato, for whom the universals are these forms that are out there in some intelligible world, for Aristotle, the universals are there in the particular things, in the substances, you could say, and then we have kind of copies of them or apprehensions of them in our minds that we don't really abstract it. That's not really Aristotle's theory. You're not going to find the word abstraction in there. That's read in later on, but something like that. Kyle Irwin, have you read Middleton's work on Nietzsche's letters? I have not. And as a matter of fact, let me say from the beginning that when it comes to most of these philosophical figures that I work on, I do not spend very much time at all with secondary literature, in part because I simply don't have the time. The people who I write on, if you ever look at my CV, you'll notice that I've done a lot of writing on Aristotle, Thomas Hobbes, Anselm, Maurice Blondel, a little bit on Hegel, a little bit on, well, some on Jacques Lacan. Then I actually spend a good bit of time like going over the secondary literature, but I just don't really have the time for it most of the time. Anas Amir asks, what books do you recommend reading on philosophy of technology? Well, so that's not really an area that I'm all that well versed in. But I should be, in part because what I'm doing is totally mediated through technology, isn't it? At least much of it. And when I'm doing something face-to-face, of course, it may not be. I think that for philosophy of technology, Heidegger, John Dewey, very important people to look at, sort of, foundational thinkers. Of course, you want to read Bacon, and Leibniz has some interesting things to say about that apply to technology, I think. When it comes to like cutting edge stuff, I don't really know who the key thinkers are, and I'm not much more than like a dabbler in that field, but I really probably should get my head around that. The trick is finding the time, so I don't have a lot of great examples. All right, so I just lost the thread for a sec. When a lot of questions pile up, it suddenly skips. Okay, so I'm only going to answer one of Zero Faux Iffy's 2 questions here because I want to get to everybody's. What is your opinion on Martin Heidegger's on being the most important metaphysical question? I don't think there is a most important metaphysical question. So I think that a lot of people doing metaphysics will often center their work around something that they think is the most important metaphysical question. And I think it's perfectly fine because that drives their research project. But I myself don't think that there's one single thing that is the most, important one that puts them all into context. I look at it as sort of like a constellation of important ideas. Here's a really interesting question from Tara Al-Qadi. I'm very interested in philosophy and I have a very rough idea, but it's a mishmash. I wonder if you have any advice so I learn in a disciplined way. So this is a really great question. And I think it's applicable to many, many people. And I get variations on this from time to time. So let me say from the beginning that it's okay if it's a mishmash. And in two ways. One is, philosophical works, very often you're not going to get everything out of them the first or even the fifth time reading through them. And, there's some where you read it at a certain stage in your life, and then you read it much later, and you're like, wow, there's so much more in this than I realized when I was reading it when I was 14, 18, 24, 20, 28. And that's okay. Sometimes, things have to work on us for a while before they stick, before we really get something out of it. And, it's always a question like, well, which particular philosophers do I have to read? I want to, make sure that I'm not, wasting my time on people who aren't that important or aren't going to be that fruitful for me. And there's all sorts of guides out there about, well, you should read this, read this, read this. Nobody really has the definitive position on this, because it is something that we do have to work out on our own. I don't think that everybody has to read Hegel, but I am devoting I've devoted now 3.5 years to creating, at this point, 207 videos on Hegel's phenomenology to help people read Hegel if they want to. I don't think that everybody has to read Heidegger. I think that everybody probably should read Plato at some point, and Descartes at some point, and probably, Aristotle and the Stoics, but I'm not going to say that you absolutely cannot think philosophically without encountering them. And so what we do is we read some, and then it's sort of like this endless accumulative process. You read some, and you're like, oh, that was pretty interesting. I think I've got some of these ideas. And then, of course, some of them vanish from your head as you're trying to explain it to people, but you go back and you read it again, and then you read somebody else who's referencing them, and you're like, wow, they got something out of that very different than what I did. Maybe I'll go back and reread and see if that's in there, or if maybe they're off base. Great example of this. If you read Plato's dialogues and then go and read Kierkegaard, who wrote his dissertation on Plato's conception of irony, and then you go back and you're rereading Plato's dialogues, you're probably going to read them in a different way. Similarly, if you read Nietzsche and you see what he makes of Socrates, or you read other people as well. So I don't really have any helpful advice, I think, but maybe that is helpful. Now here's an interesting question, totally shifting gears, from Tony Atkinson. I have a kind of a populist question, but I think it's important. How do you tackle the question, do good looks matter, or does beauty matter? So if you're asking how do I tackle it in my own personal life, it depends on what you mean by matter. Obviously, I think that it's important that I look good, and I'm glad that my wife looks good too. And it's about as far as I can go with it. If we're talking about whether looks should matter, like maybe in certain fields or something, I think there's somewhere that's totally irrelevant. Like, looks really don't have anything to do with whether you do philosophy well. Although, what we do find is that student evaluations often tend to correlate with, the appearance of a person, which is not a good thing. There's probably some fields where you do need to be good looking, fashion model, right? But, we have very different ideas about what constitutes good looks. I look at fashion models and I'm like, wow, they are anorexically skinny. And that does not do anything for me whatsoever. I don't understand why everyone thinks this is really great stuff. And then when you talk with other people, you often hear them saying the same thing. So I don't know really what to make of that. I mean, we could also talk in terms of like design too. Should we design things to just do their job, or should we design them to look good as well? You might ask the same question about food, does presentation matter? I suppose it does, So I don't really have a great answer, unfortunately, for you on that one. So here's an interesting one. And I realize I'm probably abusing the word interesting at this point. I'll try to stop doing that. It's from bourgeois. That's a nice little play on words there. I found what you're doing is an amazing thing. You're helping many people around the world. Which philosopher caught your attention that made you pick this path? There wasn't any philosopher that got me doing what I'm doing, unless I suppose if I count my wife as a philosopher, because she is studying philosophy, and she is awfully smart. So I'm sure that a lot of people watching this have already heard this backstory, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. The work with YouTube, posting videos and stuff like that, started originally because my at that time fiance got me one of these little flip cams. Not this one in particular. It was bulkier, and it actually said Flip on it because back at that time there was a company called Flip, which went bankrupt eventually, I think. So I began recording my lectures in this critical thinking class, and I couldn't upload them to my own YouTube channel because there were limits on you could only load about 10 minutes or 15 minutes in. So we put them in the Fayetteville State University channel, and that's where you'll still find them because they own those videos. At the same time, I was recording shorter videos called Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talk, which is a way to kind of stick it to the educational experts who are saying, chalk and talk is dead. Don't lecture. It's all got to be interactive. And I was like, well, I don't know. Maybe if you lecture well, that won't be the case. So the videos really caught on. And people were saying, oh, this is really helpful. And they were saying it's really helpful in large part because usually their instructors were unhelpful, or they weren't able to go to college and they were happy to be able to watch these videos. Then when I moved up to New York, and there's a whole story there. We moved up to New York, was only teaching part-time, was teaching at Marist College. They allowed me to video record my class lectures. And now we were actually doing real philosophy, like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, all the way on to like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And those really caught on, and more people started making requests, and I started shifting some of my time to creating videos that were no longer in front of a class, but shot just like in here, like in front of a chalkboard. That's part of our investment, that tripod right there, that chalkboard right there, the lighting stuff that you kind of see here. All of that we acquired it in order to do this kind of work. There wasn't any particular philosopher that got me into that, but I will say this to kind of bring it to a close. I'm very privileged in that I get to do the kind of work that I do. And I actually facetiously tell people that I'm in sales. My product is philosophy. My customers are the people out there. And my value proposition is that philosophy properly understood will make a difference in their lives. And I've got a really, really good product, so I don't have to do a lot of salesmanship, but I do have to do some translation work. I do have to like getting people into the showroom, So if I can get them in the showroom and get them behind the wheel of an Aristotle text and help them with the transition so they can figure out, they've never done a manual transmission, so they can actually shift the gears right. And get them out to do a test drive, then they will continue on with Aristotle, many of them, the rest of their life, or the Stoics, or Descartes, or whoever. So yeah, a lot of verbiage for that one. Here's an interesting one. Jiminy Cricket. If the works of every philosopher had to be destroyed, all but one, and you had to choose whose work would you choose to be the foundation of the rebirth of philosophy? I don't really know, but I think that you'd want to pick somebody who summarized other people's philosophical positions, so you'd get more than one person in there. So some of these great assimilators, like Cicero or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, probably would be in there. The Triple Perspectives asks, what's the best way to read Summa Theologiae? That's Thomas Aquinas's main work. Well, keep in mind that it is dialectical. So he's going to begin with positions for, a position against, and then give you his own position. The other thing to keep in mind, I would say, with Thomas Aquinas, this applies to other philosophers too, is, it's very structured, right? And so you think that he's going to talk about this particular topic at this particular point, and that'll be like the whole discussion of it. That's almost never the case in Thomas Aquinas. He'll talk about, for example, the will early on in the Prima Pars, right? But you got to read a whole bunch of other things to get a fuller conception of the will in Thomas Aquinas's philosophy. And it works that way. So you got to do a lot of drawing connections, and you got to read across the work. Kyle Irwin, what is your take on Popper's view of Plato in his Open Society? I'm not a fan of Popper. I think that his discussions about verifiability are interesting and worth looking at. The Open Society is kind of just a hit piece. I think you could plausibly make the case that perhaps some of the later thinkers that he's talking about could, in fact, be tenuously connected with totalitarianism. Plato, no. I mean, he's Popper's not a good reader of philosophy. As a matter of fact, he's not worth taking the time to take seriously, given that we don't have that much time. But he is very popular. There's a lot of people who read the Open Society and its enemies. Against unjust authority, do you think Camus' philosophy, the absurd hero, is similar to an anarchist philosophy? Yeah, I'd say Camus problematizes any sort of order that we have. And I think if you want to see where it really plays itself out, you want to look at not The Stranger, which is kind of early, in some respects uncharacteristic text, or the Mythosiphysicists, and you want to look at his later writings like The Rebel, for example, or Letters to a German Friend. These are particularly good at sort of problematizing any form of government that's attempting to work for justice. There's some long-standing issues there for him. Joseph Tucker asks, what are a few of your favorite existentialist novels? That's an interesting question. I do really like Nausea. Reading it in my 40s as opposed to reading it in my 20s, I think I missed an awful lot in my 20s. Rilke's Notebooks of Malta Lorenz Briga, very interesting piece. Of course, Camus, The Plague is pretty amazing stuff, but The Fall is pretty cool as well. That's probably enough on that. Unfortunately, Amin, I do not have any view on Al-Ghazali because I don't read enough of his stuff. John Fisher Quire, what are your views on animal rights argument and contemporary analytic philosophy with Peter Singer? He's the only one of them I've read. I haven't read Tom Regan or Jeff McMahon, so I can't really say anything about them. Peter Singer, interesting guy. I like consistency, and he is very consistent across the board. I mean, if you want somebody who you really know where he's coming from, that's Peter Singer. This is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, but I haven't been talking about much. Not least as we move in our household, originally for health reasons, and then for a lot of ethical reasons towards a much more plant-based diet. But I still have a lot more thinking to do about that issue. Let's go. Okay. Oh, here's an interesting question. Democritus Jr., Dr. Sadler, in what aspects do you consider Christianity improved on their Neoplatonic predecessors? Well, I mean, it's important to keep in mind that there's really three flavors of Neoplatonism in its early development: pagan, Jewish, and Christian. Augustine is a Christian Neoplatonist. Pretty much, all the people you're going to read in the Philokalia are in some respect Platonists. If not Neoplatonists, at least sort of Plutarchian middle Platonists adding Christianity to the mix. Many of the early Christian philosophers, like Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, they're looking at Platonism as sort of like the closest thing to Christianity. As a matter of fact, Clement's really interesting because he considers Greek philosophy to be a preparatio evangelii, a preparation for the gospel, in the same way that the Jewish scriptures, from the Christian perspective, called the Old Testament, had been for the Jews. Greek philosophy was that for the Greeks, according to Clement. I would say that what Christianity added to the mix was in part this sort of a richer conception of the human person, sort of other meditations upon the nature of sin, some sort of coherent understanding of what the human relationship to the divine involving prayer or other things would be. And then there's this attempt to try to bring all these things together in some sort of coherent perspective. Not always successful. The other philosophy too that we should think of as having exerted a very important influence on Christian thought would be, of course, Stoicism. Aristotelianism kind of fits in there, much more in the later Middle Ages, but Platonism and Stoicism. If you read John Cassian, for example, and look at some of these conferences with the monks, and you'll see some Stoic things showing up without being called that. A lot of other Platonist things as well, too. Johannes G. Haldorson, is there a deeper is-ought problem than just how things are isn't necessarily how they should be? If so, what's the logic for oughts being impossible? So this is going to strike a lot of people as being almost, paradoxical or heretical. When I hear about the is-ought thing, I usually sort of just turn my ears off because most of the stuff about it doesn't really apply. Hume didn't say that you can't derive an ought from an is. He says that you can't derive an ought solely from an is. We've always got all sorts of oughts in the background as sort of assumptions and premises, and so that's that's as much as I'm going to say about the is-ought distinction there. But now the deeper is-ought problem than just how things are isn't necessarily how they should be. So there is a disconnect between at many points how things are, how we experience them, and how we think they ought to be. In some respect, that's not really a problem. The issue then is to ask ourselves, okay, well, what's causing this? And we've got all sorts of answers like, well, human beings are dummies, and screw things up. And that actually answers a lot of our questions about that sort of thing. Why are things so screwed up? Well, because this guy over here made this dumb decision, and this guy over here responded to it in a dumb way. And now that doesn't answer everything, but it does cover a lot of ground. I'm not quite sure what else I can say about that. Sevkin, what is the best general book to get started in philosophy, especially on the Greeks? I think it's good to start with the primary sources. And I'm going to say something here that I haven't said before, but I think could actually be kind of a good thing to do. I usually say start with Plato, right? But maybe it'd be better to start with Xenophon and his discussions of Socrates, then jumping right into some of Plato's early operatic dialogues, where Socrates is really the central figure, and then maybe compare the two of them, and then start from that point of view. But I think it's important. I don't think that. There's lots of secondary literature out there. I'm not going to say I think this is much better. There's so much out there that you can sort of pick and choose, and go to the library and run through it and see what actually makes sense for you and what you get something out of. But I think that at a certain point, I think early on, you want to start working with primary texts. And I'm actually going to give you kind of a pep talk here that I give my students, who are these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids when I teach college classes, I tell them, look, I know that you didn't read any of this stuff K through 12 unless you went through, a really good school. And even then, your teachers might not have been particularly good. So, when I tell you that we're going to be reading some Plato, some Aristotle, some Cicero, some this, some that, you're probably really worried about that. Everybody that I have in my classes is up to reading at least some of these philosophers and making some sense out of them, and getting something out of it. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah, it requires having some support, but there's plenty of resources out there. Deus Ex Anonymous, would you consider doing some videos on Walter Benjamin or Max Stirner? Yeah, I'd consider doing videos on just about anybody, but I have a huge backlog of stuff that I'm working on and only 24 hours in each day. So this is where I actually, I created a video. Dr. Sadler responds, why don't you create videos about such and such? And in it, I suggested that, look, there's two things. Either you got to wait until I decide to get to that stuff, or you can commission me to do that. And every once in a while, I get people wanting to do that. Light in the night, what do you think is the future of philosophy? Oh, that's a good question. So I think that if we think about philosophy in terms of academic philosophy, there's all these people who are like, oh, philosophy's dead, and there's always some silly argument about that. And if you have any historical knowledge, you know that people have been saying that for over 100 years. So that's nonsense. But academic philosophy, as academic philosophy, is on life support in many places, and deservedly so, because academic philosophers in general have done a terrible job in showing that they were relevant, other than sort of platitudes about, oh, we're going to help you with critical thinking, and who cares? I mean, you can in fact do that in history, in English, in business classes if you teach them well. Generally, that means bringing in some experts who are often philosophers, but it can be done, right? I'm not somebody who thinks that academic philosophy really has to be at the center of things unless it makes its case, and that requires everybody in that department pulling their weight and showing day after day after day how what they do really matters. I remember, this is kind of funny. See, I come from the trenches when it comes to philosophy, right? I've never had a cush position where I taught 2 classes per semester and got paid better than the people teaching 4 4s or any of that sort of stuff. So I have very, very little sympathy for those who are in those positions and say that they don't have enough time to do outreach. I remember being on a fellowship at Notre Dame, a summer fellowship that I had applied for and got into with Alistair McIntyre. And we're sitting there at breakfast because all of us fellowship members ate together. And I remember this one person saying, I'm having a lot of trouble getting research done and published. And we're all, oh, that's too bad. What's that about? Well, I'm teaching a 5. And at that time, I was routinely teaching 5 classes a semester. So a 5-5, right? And so I commiserated and I said, yeah, since I've been teaching 5 classes per semester, I'm only publishing about 1 or 2 articles a year. And she turned to me and she said, oh, I'm teaching 5 classes a year, a 3-2. And I was like, and you're having trouble publishing? You're having trouble getting your work done? I don't have any sort of sympathy for that sort of thing at all. So, I think that academic philosophers, what is the future of philosophy? It's not really with them. They're going to, keep on doing what they're doing. They're going to be well supported in elite institutions. They're going to have to really struggle, and where they're really doing the most work is going to be in the lower level institutions. Where the future of philosophy lies, I think, is in this sort of thing that we're doing right here. I think that it exists in doing philosophy in more public, practical, and professional, but not academically professional ways. And I see that as sort of a reversion back to earlier times, and I'm comfortable with it. So that's enough of my stump speech there, I think. Jose Maria Delgado, not a question there, just a nice comment. I'm watching you from Venezuela. I'm very grateful for your reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit of Hegel. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for saying that. I'm glad that you enjoy it. I think I have a little less than 2 years more to put in on it if I stay on track. And then I got to think about what I'm going to do next. Sako Arzuman, what is your opinion about Tillich's God above God? Please elaborate. I don't remember. I remember reading Tillich a long time ago. I don't remember that. God above God reminds me more of Meister Eckhart and the sort of, Godhead above the God. I don't really have a view on it other than to say that it sounds sort of like Gnosticism to me. That's always been my impression. Jed, on the subject of Max Stirner, have you read much or Ernst Jünger? If so, what did you think of his work? I read Stirner a long time ago, and I read some Jünger a long time ago, but it's been so long that I can't really say much about it. Jünger I read originally because I had a very strong interest in fascist studies, which was spurred from doing work on Action Française, which was a proto-fascist French monarchist organization. And the reason I was doing work on them is because the guy I was working on, Maurice Blondel, was one of their deadly enemies. By the way, somebody who was a member of Action Française, who was also an enemy of Blondel within the same Catholic circles, Jacques Maritain, who didn't quit until the Action Française was condemned. So I read some Jünger, and interesting work. I'd have to go back to it to really have anything useful to say. Harbinger X, what's your thoughts on Marx? That's a loaded question there. I read and I teach Marx. I'm not a Marxist, although I've actually worked at one time for a Marxist organization because I'm kind of an interesting hired gun in many respects. I can get along with people from all sorts of ideological backgrounds and work within their organizations. I think that Marx is actually right on some things. I agree with somebody like, say, Max Scheler, who says, Marx is good, but often one-sided because there's such a reduction of things to the economic. And Marx becomes sort of like, Hegel and sort of like Nietzsche, what we call a wax nose. He gets bent to use by so many people for so many reasons. I will say one thing too, because there's Marx, like actually reading Marx and then talking about that, and then like serious socialist and communist parties and movements and all that, and then there's this like sort of fuzzy Marxist stuff over here, and then there's like the criticisms of cultural Marxism. I think that most of the people who talk about cultural Marxism are painting with such a broad brush that they quite often don't know what they're talking about. And I think that sort of criticism of the right of the left. I think the same thing goes for a lot of criticisms for coming from the left of the right as well. So I think it's important to be kind of careful with that. I'll tell you too, when it comes down to it, my favorite work by Marx is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which is really less about like economic theory or stuff like that, and more about how infighting within a political system leads eventually to some candidate coming in who doesn't represent any class, just represents power, and is able to grasp it and take it. Sort of prescient for what sometimes happens in political systems. Let's see here. So Pontanal has a has a good question. Can I talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorem and its importance to epistemology and philosophy at large? So this is an area where I think I've seen a lot of people kind of misusing or referencing, Gödel's incompleteness theorem in a way that doesn't really help out. It's strictly speaking, it's saying that any formal system is either going to be incomplete or it's going to be inconsistent. So what do we mean by a formal system? Something that can be modeled mathematically. So it really only applies to things where we have an assumption that there is mathematical modeling possible. And there's other ways of arranging this as well. You could say it could be modeled logically, right? But that's going to ultimately come down to some sort of functions and things like that. And it's this very, very complicated proof to show that it's not the case that like everything goes out the window. It's just that you're not going to be able to have a completely either coherent or complete, I realize I've used the word complete there twice, system that covers everything. So the upshot of this was that the Logicist project was really a non-starter. And any idea that will reduce everything down to algorithms or something along those lines is a non-starter too. It doesn't rule out the possibility of artificial intelligence. Doesn't say that mathematics is now all up for grabs or anything like that, right? It's got a somewhat limited application. Jazz Cower, thank you for your lectures. It's an honor learning from you. I understand each and every lecture of yours. I've learned so much from your lectures. That's very nice to say. Ex nihilo, is life worth living? Yeah, I'd say it is. You can usually find at least something in it that isn't completely crap, even when your life is really crappy. And I've been at some situations in my life where it's been pretty crappy. But there's usually something worth sticking to. Now that said, I'm not going to be preachy about it and tell everybody, oh, whatever you're going through, there's a silver lining to your cloud or anything like that, because sometimes it is just like crap heaped on crap heaped on crap. But I'm not one of the ultimate pessimists, you could say. Etax, any opinions on Peter Singer? I talked about him a little bit. I think Singer is an interesting figure. I like I said, I really like consistency. I like when you know where somebody's coming from. And he is definitely somebody in the utilitarian tradition. So I reference him in my classes. Thoughts on Jordan Peterson? Jordan Peterson is an interesting fellow. I get a lot of people telling me that I should have a dialogue with him, or why am I not interviewing him, or I should change what I'm doing and try to be a Jordan Peterson clone. I get a lot of different things along those lines. What do I think of his approach to repopularizing traditional values? I don't actually know enough about it to say much, because I don't get that much time to spend, like I said, on looking at other people's things. I hear a lot of people talking about who's attacking postmodernism. When I hear somebody saying anything critical about postmodernism, it's sort of like hearing them talk about cultural Marxism. It could mean a million different things. So I'd have to take a closer look, and that means I'd have to carve out time in order to do that. I know that because of his attacks on certain parts of the left, he's become kind of popular on the right. But I suspect that if he really is, a great thinker, he's not going to remain popular with the right all that long, because a lot of that tends to be kind of lowest common denominator stuff. But that's the way it is with philosophy. Aristotle pointed out this dynamic, a long time ago. In any given society, you generally have two sides. He was talking about, say, the rich and the many, and they both think that they're completely in the right and the others are completely in the wrong. And then you have the good, and they don't coincide with either of those. The aristoi, the people who really deserve to rule, but are least likely to engage in all the electioneering and cultural politics and all that sort of stuff. And so they're the ones who hold everything together. I think that dynamic applies today as well. All right, so Gubraj Kang. When I read Schopenhauer, I can understand his teachings very clearly. When I try my hand on Nietzsche, I find it more difficult to understand any ideas of why. Well, there are different kinds of thinkers, and they write differently. I think that there's a couple different things that we can say generally. We often find ourselves responding to and getting certain figures more easily than others. So for example, when I read Jeremy Bentham, I find him very boring, but I can understand what he's doing. I find Kant challenging, and I don't actually agree with Kant on a lot of stuff, but I can see the big picture and make sense of it. Schopenhauer is very, very fun to read, and I understand how he's working things out as well. Nietzsche is a very different stylist, and Nietzsche also is much less concerned with consistency than somebody like Schopenhauer is. So I think it requires a different work. Nietzsche also coins a lot more words. He's playing with language pretty heavily in his work. You can see this especially when you read it in the German, in which it's quite beautiful work, except when he tries his hand at writing poetry, which is not very good at all. So I wouldn't take it too hard. It's interesting. I'll tell you from my perspective, there are thinkers who I really enjoy, and I think their ideas are great, but I find it very difficult to write on them. And then there's others that I find it very easy to write about, like Aristotle. I have no trouble writing whatever somebody wants me to write on Aristotle. When I have to write something on Plato, things get a bit dicier for me, and I don't really know why. But I do that, and I know that it is the case. that happens. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just keep plowing away at the Nietzsche if he's somebody that you want to read. Some thinkers are always difficult. Hegel, great example. I'm doing this half-hour Hegel project. I've been reading Hegel for over 20 years. I teach him, and yet I go to the phenomenology and I reread, and I read it in the German. Sometimes I even check the French translation as well to see what Hippolyte made of it. And sometimes I'm like, I can't figure out any of this stuff. And it varies from day to day. Some days it clicks better, other days it doesn't. So don't let it get you down. Let's see. Here we go. Just had a big skip here. A lot of stuff here that I got to scroll up through. Wow. I don't know that I'm going to get to all of this. I think we might have to do sort of a lightning round of questions. Okay, here we're back. What do I think of arguments for the existence of God? I think that they're very interesting. I don't know that people are often convinced by them. I can tell you that I myself have sort of labored on and off with the ontological argument, so-called, because it's not really an ontological argument the way that textbooks make it out to be, of St. Anselm for a long time. Thoughts on Slavoj Žižek? He's interesting. I wish that I had more time to spend on reading his stuff because I find it very uneven. And frankly, I just, I'd rather, read Hegel or read Marx or read Kant. Let's see here. Why do you think Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is preferred to a science of logic? Because it became popular in the mid-20th century. The logic was more popular. Well, the encyclopedia logic was really the most popular. But the science of logic was what a lot of philosophers were thinking of in terms of Hegel around the turn of the last century. And the phenomenology became the book to read. And so now we just kind of follow along with that. And Hegel is so tough that it's really hard to do more than one. How did I learn ancient Greek? I took courses, as opposed to most of the other languages that I work with, where I effectively taught myself. I did, in fact, take a sequence of Greek classes at Southern Illinois University, and then I just kept on with the reading. Let's see. Did I read any secondary material on the phenomenology of spirit? What is my favorite? My favorite is Hippolyte. And yeah, I read a lot of secondary material on the phenomenology of spirit, back when I was going to write my dissertation on Hegel. I don't read an awful lot these days, again, because I don't have a lot of time. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people like to read Kojève. You're really getting a lot more Kojève than you are Hegel when you read Kojève, and that's okay, you know, because Kojève is funny too. Um, um, do I think the Aristotelian theory of causes is useful for us? It can be. I think that it can be useful as a heuristic sometimes, but I don't think it provides us with an adequate metaphysical understanding of things. Have I read The System of Ethical Life by Hegel? Yes, I've read that a long time ago. That's a good thing to read. What are my thoughts on Deleuze? Interesting thinker. I like some of his essays quite a bit. I don't really buy into the sort of overall project, and I think that Deleuze became very popular at a certain point, and sooner or later everybody had to talk about Deleuze, and I think that Deleuze is such a difficult thinker at many points that many of the people who talk about Deleuze really don't understand what he's saying, but he lends himself to a lot of fun, interpretations and applications to things. I was when I was doing early modern philosophy, I was really getting into his works on that, which I enjoyed. Let's see. What do I think of the claims coming from the political right that postmodernism is somehow responsible for vicious moral relativism and degradation? I think it's nonsense. I think the idea that somehow Derrida or Lyotard or Foucault is responsible for that is just terrible political philosophy. Both right and left have gutted our culture and our political system. And I think they both have about equal share in responsibility in many different ways, playing off of each other, and then leaving the rest of us holding the bag in the middle. So, but it's typical. And again, if we look back through history, it really helps to know about the history of ideas, because you can see a lot of the same movements, a lot of the same criticisms getting made over and over again, just slightly different terminology, slightly different ideas. What the political right is doing today, read about Action Française, and you'll see a lot of the same, ideas, techniques being used against their opponents at that time. What is my favorite work by Nietzsche, and why is it on the genealogy of morality? That's a great loaded question, right? That is indeed my favorite work by Nietzsche, although The Birth of Tragedy comes pretty close. Why is it the genealogy? I am a sucker for taking a more systematic approach. So, I really do enjoy like Beyond Good and Evil and, Human All Too Human as well. But I like the fact that there's like a more coherent picture being drawn in those two works. And I think that if you're going to study Nietzsche, those two are really important. Thus, Zarathustra is really important as well. Katerina asks, what is your view on Plato's beautiful bodies, the succession of beautiful objects? If I understand correctly, is in the symposium should mean that someone with a beautiful soul must have a beautiful face. You'd think so, but Alcibiades shows us that you can be pretty ugly, like Socrates is, and have a beautiful soul. Dutz asks, Ayn Rand once said the problems in America are philosophical, mainly criticizing Immanuel Kant with the argument that he's anti-reason. What do you think about that? I think Rand was quite bad when it came to her assessments of other philosophers. And I'd say she's on the level of sort of Russell or Popper when it comes to history of philosophy. I don't know, the notion that somehow philosophical ideas are behind cultural decline, that's a big stretch. All right, let's see what else we got here. Here's a question that's not about philosophy. Tough one. What is your favorite metal album? If you would have asked me when I was a young man, I would have said automatically Iron Maiden, Peace of Mind. And now, I don't know. I mean, Maybe it would be, if I had to pick one, Dio's Holy Diver or Motorhead's Overkill. So, but that's a tough one for me. I'm going to go a little bit longer. It's 3 o'clock now, but I'll try to take some of these that I can get to fairly quickly. Oh, here's a great one. What do you take the relation between philosophical writing and rhetoric from Dash? So, Aristotle, in his work on rhetoric, says that all teaching involves some degree of persuasion. And I think he's right. There is always a rhetoric involved in all philosophical writing, the notion that we can be like purely, without any sort of element of focusing on the audience or structure or without engaging in persuasion, I think is nonsense. It doesn't all boil down to just persuasion, but I think it plays an important role. And if we want to be effective as philosophers, we need to study rhetoric. We shouldn't leave that to the rhetoricians. All right. Here's a good one. Is phenomenology dead? Has it been killed off by speculative realism and object-oriented ontology? Definitely not. Phenomenology is alive and well. I actually share my office with a Husserlian, of all types. I mean, that somebody's really serious in their phenomenology stuff when they're doing Husserl, because Husserl's pretty dry, but he thinks it's great stuff. No, phenomenology is going to be around, for the foreseeable future. This notion that we see in continental philosophy so often. There's also analogs in analytic philosophy that like one movement comes along, now this other movement, it's dead. That's journalism. That's not philosophy. And again, looking back, historical perspective, you're going to see lots and lots and lots of that. What do I think about Sam Harris and the likes? I don't really take Harris that seriously, but then again, I don't really, I've read bits of his stuff, so I can't really comment that much on it, but I've never been much impressed by what I've read or by people telling me about Harris. This is kind of funny from JP455. I can tell that Sadler's a big fan of George Soros. No, I've actually been a big critic of Soros for about 15 years. As a matter, I've mentioned him as an example of somebody who I think is corrupting the body politic. Usually when somebody brings up the Koch brothers, I bring up Soros. But it's funny because a lot of the time, the enemy of the friend of my enemy is my enemy. And there's this whole logic that goes with it. I'm in the middle. And I'm in the middle in part because the left is nutty and the right is nutty. And they're nutty for different reasons. And they're usually off base on a lot of things. And I don't even get along with a lot of the centrists, But one thing that's a constant is people on the left thinking I'm on the right, people on the right thinking I'm on the left. And a lot of my friends are in that boat too. Okay. So Muhammad Usman has a great question. What's the difference between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy if there are such different philosophies? Well, there isn't a Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. The whole category of Eastern philosophy is a sort of Western construction of stuff. The Chinese tradition in philosophy is just as rich as what we call the Western tradition, so is the Indian tradition. Islamic philosophy, and there was quite a bit of it. We're always, discovering more and more interesting texts. Kind of fits into the West, kind of not. Great example of this is just right down the street at Marquette University, a friend and colleague of mine, Richard Taylor, the Aquinas and the Arabs project. He's got his students reading Averroes and Ibn, and all these, Al-Farabi and all these great thinkers. And connecting it with scholasticism and what was going on, doing comparative work. Taylor just gave an amazing talk about abstraction and what's going on in Averroes' work about happiness. The notion that there's somehow something called Western philosophy that's opposed to Eastern philosophy, I think is kind of the sort of stuff we do in textbooks, but it doesn't hold up. There have been confluences back and forth. Think about the effects of running into Indian thought. Think about Arthur Schopenhauer, right? Or think about the comparative work that went on. We talk about comparative philosophy. If you're going to talk about virtue ethics in a serious way, you probably want to know something about, say, the Confucian tradition. So it's very difficult to wrap your head around the totality of everything that's happening in all of that. So let's see. Thoughts on Derrida? I almost wrote my dissertation on him at one point. Kind of funny. I'll tell you the story. So I was very into Derrida. I went through a Derrida phase where I was, really, really working with his stuff and getting totally into it, and even like getting into polemics with, Derrida versus Deleuze, Derrida versus Foucault, right? And I went to Stephen Timon and I told him I want to write a dissertation on Derrida, and he said, "Let's talk about this." And he said, "I think that you want to write your dissertation on somebody who's really important for the history of philosophy, somebody who's absolutely central, like, say, Leibniz or Hegel or Aristotle. Don't write on somebody who's going to be largely a footnote down the line." Now, that may sound very dismissive, but, I think when it comes down to it, 50 years from now, there's not going to be a lot of people reading Derrida and using his thought for things. I think there will be people still, focusing on Heidegger. I think there will still be people focusing on Wittgenstein. I think there will still be people working on Alasdair MacIntyre. I don't think there will be people working on Derrida. I do think, by the way, there will be people using Foucault. I think that his works have a greater lasting power than Derrida's do. Let's see. Ruby De Silva, what are your thoughts on Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy? It's not worth taking seriously. If you want a good history of philosophy from that time, read Friedrich Cobblestone. Russell, it's like with Kojève, right? Kojève, you get Hegel through Kojève. Russell, you get all these people through Russell. It's nice stylistically because Bertrand Russell's a nice writer, but it's sort of like William Durant's history. What is his book? I forget the name of it. You can learn some things from it, but then you go and read the philosophers, and you're like, well, he was totally off about this. So I think it's not a particularly good work. I'm going to skip over these long questions. Have I read any Dostoevsky? I've done videos on Dostoevsky. I am a big fan of Dostoevsky, actually. And interestingly, my favorite novel by him is not The Brothers Karamazov, that that's his masterpiece. Do you know what I think his masterpiece is? It's the one that's translated either as The Possessed or The Devils. That is a really, really great piece. I love that one. I suppose some people probably think Crime and Punishment is the best one too, but I like that one the best. Scrolling down. Pedro Silva, do a series on Neoplatonism, reading works from Proclus, Iamblichus, Plotinus, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Cappadocian Fathers. Well, that would be a lot of work. So again, that's where commissioning videos would be the way to do it. I've got so much, right now on my desktop, I've got all these Cicero video frames that I need to get to. And then I have other stuff from my classes. And I got to shoot a whole sequence on Wollstonecraft as well, and more Nietzsche, more Heidegger. Got a lot of stuff to do. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting one. Vasily Meyer. If God is dead, is there any way to avoid moral relativism? We're talking, if God is dead, we're talking about what Nietzsche was calling the transvaluation of values and the issue of nihilism. the devaluation of the highest value. Yeah, I mean, Camus avoided it, right? Again, read not just the Mythosiphysicist, but the Rebel, where that was an issue. Could human nature, biology offer an objective morality? Still an is-ought problem there. Well, I've already weighed in on the is-ought problem. I'm not so worried about that as many people are. But could just looking at human nature, biology offer an objective morality? It can certainly offer something that presents itself as an objective morality. It's not going to really take hold because it's not an adequate way to understand the human being. It's only one dimension of human existence. The meat and neurons that we've got. There's so much more. And it's interesting. There's other great thinkers who take this on. Jacques Lacan is a prime example himself, because Lacan, is one of these people growing up in a Catholic milieu, rejecting it entirely, and yet at the same time he thinks that there's something really important about Christianity, and that what we would nowadays call our contemporary atheism is totally off base in its views about things. I think there's plenty of models for people talking about things after God is dead. And some of them are religious thinkers. Look at Gabriel Marcel. He's writing in a framework that doesn't assume that you can just sort of like bring God into the picture and fix everything. What is Donald Trump's philosophy? I don't know that there's anything so elevated as philosophy going on in his head or his practice. Yeah, Trumpism. Okay, yeah, but nobody knows what that is, and it seems to change from month to month. Okay. Oh, this is great. Trust me, it's the best. Nobody philosophies better than Trump. Huge. I think that's perfectly on point there. Yeah. Okay, let me see if I can get to the end. Let's see. A lot of back and forth discussion. Yeah, do I think there's such a thing as Christian philosophy or Christian thought, or is there an inherent contradiction between theology and philosophy today? Well, that's why I wrote a book on the Christian philosophy debates. I certainly think there's not just a Christian philosophy. I think there's multiple Christian philosophies that are intrinsically Christian and intrinsically philosophical. I'd say the same thing for Jewish. Philo of Alexandria, back in ancient times, Jewish Neoplatonist, really interesting guy. Let's see, what else have we got here? What is my opinion on psychiatry? Well, it depends on the psychiatrist. I was actually telling a funny story. I used to go to a psychiatrist because I was taking an antidepressant, and I needed, every so often to see the guy for, renewing the dosage. And I'd go in, and he would get my folder, and he'd open it up, and he never knew who I was. He had no clue. And he asked me the same questions every single time. And then he'd find out that I was a philosophy professor. And he's, oh, that's very interesting. And let's talk about that. And he'd ask me the same damn questions about that too each time. And at first I was kind of ticked off because I was like, my insurance is picking this up, but look at this guy, he's what the hell is he doing, and then after a while, I just kind of brushed it off. Now, not all psychiatrists are like that, but I think psychiatry is a pretty hit and miss across the board. A lot of it has to do with the person, him or herself. Let's see. Don't be a Jordan Peterson clone. Yeah, I don't think there's any worry about that. I don't think I could. Any thoughts on Lacan? Yeah, I've written on Lacan. If you go to my academia.edu, you're going to see some of my writings on him. I like him. Could I summarize Hegel's entire philosophy in under a minute? No, not possible. That would be kind of cool if I could, but I'm not the guy to do it. Okay, so I think we are pretty much at a close. A lot of the stuff is chatter back and forth with different people. Oh, there's one. Yeah, so one good point. People talking about Cobblestone. Yeah, there's untranslated Greek and Latin. That's because Cobblestone was writing at a time when you could kind of assume that people would go in there and check it out. But it'd be kind of good to go in and do um, learn what the stuff is. Here's a great last question. This is from Lasse Justi Andreasen. Would you see yourself as a philosopher or a historian of philosophy? You seem to always tell what other great thinkers said about this and not yourself having an opinion on the issue. So I reject the distinction. And I reject the distinction the way that other great philosophers of history have. So I'm doing meta history of philosophy, right? Like Henri Gouillard. I'm a big fan of his work. I think that when we do what we're calling here history of philosophy, talking about other people's systems and their views and all that, that we are actually making it come alive and making it be viable to engage other people. And I think that's very much needed. There's a sort of history of philosophy that's I'm just going to try to figure out, what this person's ideas were, and I won't take any stand on it, and who they were influenced by, and that becomes very academic. But what I'm doing is much more akin to philosophy as a way of life, which I see as an integral part of philosophical work. I think that originality in philosophy is highly overrated. I actually did a video on this a while back. I think that much of what we call these days like original philosophy or cutting edge philosophy tends to be pretty dull and pointless stuff. And if it came down to either explicating Plato or Descartes or having my own opinions, I've put in enough time to realize that it's much more interesting, and quite frankly, these guys are often smarter than I am. And so I do, the work of bridging the gap, making them accessible for other people. But I don't see doing history of philosophy in that way as not doing philosophy. I see it as keeping the conversation going so that the people who really did contribute can speak with contemporary language to an audience. And I think that's more valuable than most of what we call philosophy today. People who are just philosophers, right? And I do plenty of opining of my own, in my off time, and I do in some of my other videos, Dr. Sadler's soapbox, right? I get up on my soapbox and spout my opinions about things. I'm going to do more of those in the future. But I've become more circumspect about that because I've realized that I probably ought to know what the hell I'm talking about if I'm going to open my mouth, And a lot of what I do with my clients, I would say is much more, on the spot, original stuff. But that's because I think philosophy pertains to the human condition. We do it in a lot of respects, in specific situations, dialogically. That doesn't get recorded unless I write case histories down the line, in which case I'll change everybody's names, of course. But yeah, so that, which am I, a philosopher, a historian of philosophy? I mean, I describe myself as a history of philosophy person, but I only do that because so many of the people out there in philosophy think that you're either analytic or continental, and history of philosophy is a nice tertium quid, right? It gets you out of their stupid battles with each other. But yeah, I suppose that's it for the answer. So about 20 minutes after, some great questions. I'm glad that you guys all tuned in, and I see there's some questions I didn't get to, but that's that's life, right? So I hope you have a great weekend. I really enjoyed this AMA session. We're going to do another one when we get to a higher level of support in Patreon. So if you're interested in supporting, just go to my Patreon page, and it's easy enough to find. You can just Google it. It's actually linked in my YouTube channel. And so if you do that, that's great. I would like to thank my Patreon supporters for helping me to earn a living doing the kind of stuff that I like, and helping other people study philosophy worldwide. So again, have a great weekend, and maybe I'll see you again. Definitely see some of you in some of our other online events.